Okay, good morning again. I don't want to repeat myself, but I really need to thank Marina and Valentina for making this wonderful international conference, this wonderful event possible here in Palermo. So thank you again, Marina and Valentina. I'm very pleased to introduce the second speaker of this first session. She's Lyndsey Stonebridge. Lyndsey is a professor who teaches modern literature and history at the School of Literature, Drama and Creative Writing at the University of East Anglia. And she's also the lead for the Humanities in Human Rights Network. Her research focuses on the connections between literature and history and politics and refugee studies and also law. So she has produced extensively within the fields of literature and politics and refugee studies. Among her major publications are the Judicial Imagination, Writing After Nuremberg, and she has recently published her monograph entitled Placeless People, Rights, Writing and Refugees. She has also produced works on psychoanalysis and modern culture, among which the writing of anxiety and British fiction after modernism. Today, her contribution is entitled Literature, Human Rights and Refugee Studies.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you wave if I start talking to myself? It's fantastic to be here, and it's a great honor, especially as an academic. We spend a lot of our times in archives and committee rooms, and it's quite a treat to be able to step out, blinking, into a community of writers and dancers, singers, musicians, poets, activists, and political workers. It's a great honor and very, very exciting. And I think, as the last session demonstrated, that imagination that Marina started by talking about this morning relies on a sense of community. Imagination doesn't happen unless communities make imagination possible. And we've just seen that in the session you just organized. And I want to talk a bit about community, but particularly the politics of community. So I've come with two refugee stories from the last century. I'm a historian and a literary critic, so I get to do both things. I get to describe what really happened and then to make it all up. Which is a great, great privilege. Two refugee stories from the last century. One's a history story and the other's a story about the journey of a poem. The history story, as Chris said, histories of migration and refugeedom go back centuries, but I do think the refugee crisis we're facing today is particularly modern, and the origins of that crisis came in the middle of the 20th century. So this is me being quite a dry historian. So first, the history story. I want to start with another refugee camp, the camp of Gurs, which is tucked in the Pyrenees in southwest France. Now, this camp started as a refugee camp. It was built in 1939 very hastily to house fleeing refugees from the Spanish Civil War and Republicans and later International Brigade volunteers. In May 1940, the camp quickly changed use. It became an internment camp for enemy aliens, and when the French authorities rounded up all childless women of a certain age, German childless women, mainly Jewish people, but also some genuine Nazis, and took them to Gurs. Among them was Hannah Arendt. It's actually Arendt's refugee stories, the political thinker and philosopher I'm going to talk about today. Now, when the Germans invaded and the armistice was signed, quite a lot of those women escaped from the camp. One of them, as I said, was Hannah Arendt, and she went to a city of refuge called Montauban, which was one of the first kind of asylum cities. Running away from the camp was a very good move. Not all the women did. They wanted to stay there because they thought their families and their lovers and their husbands could find them. But after Vichy, Gurs became a Jewish concentration camp. And by the time the resistance sabotaged camp operations in 1943, over 12,000 people, mainly women and children, had been deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Now, it's partly in Ger, and I've got an image that's circulating. I did have a slide presentation, but it got too ambitious, that Hannah Arendt, who was then just in her 30s, began to understand that being a refugee, being stateless, was more than just another modern form of human suffering. She began thinking about her masterpiece, The Origins of Totalitarianism, in this period. And she began thinking about what refugees meant in terms of her lifetime. And I think one of the reasons when we talk about cultural and intellectual human rights for refugees is because the best historians of refugee history are refugees themselves. Hannah Arendt described refugees as being always in the vanguard of history. So one of the reasons, again, to protect and nurture the intellectual rights of refugees is that we have a lot to learn from refugees. Now, what Hannah Arendt began to learn behind the barbed wire was, as I said, how the refugees of the 20th century were not simply a humanitarian crisis or tragedy, but a profoundly political and moral calamity. That was her word, and she was very careful with her words. And in fact, the refugee crisis, as today, wasn't a refugee crisis at all. It was a political crisis. It wasn't a refugee crisis. It was a political crisis. And for Hannah Arendt, it was the moment when a certain fantasy that the nation state could protect human rights fell to the ground. It was that moment when the idea that legal and political structures could protect the rights of the vulnerable fell to the ground. Now, that idea of rights being protected had already begun to wobble in Europe in the early 20th century. But Arendt said it was when Germany blithely de-citizened, literally stripped Jewish people of their citizenship with the Nuremberg laws in 1934. And when the world responded by deciding there was nothing sacred about the people who then scrambled onto boats and gathered at borders, then Arendt said the game was up for European ideas about human rights. What that tragedy revealed for Arendt is if you weren't a European citizen, this is what the refugees showed the world, you were nothing. The only rights you had were as good as the nation state you happened to live in, and if you happened to live in a racist or totalitarian state that didn't want you, that meant rights weren't very good at all. So what the Europeans discovered was what many people had understood in their own lands, who'd been displaced in their own lands by European colonialism long before the huts and gers were even built, was that the European model of the nation state was a very, very poor protector of humanity. That was the crisis that Arendt identified, herself a refugee behind the barbed wire on the refugee trails. Now, the flurry of human rights and refugee legislation that followed World War II, which basically set out the architecture, the legal and political architecture that we live with today, and a lot of you I know are activists and have to work with this framework, and it is very, very difficult, was intended precisely to protect those who fell or had been forced out of their homes, of their nation states. But as the mass displacements that came with the imposition of new nation states after the war and new forms of colonialism, Israel-Palestine, most obviously, India-Pakistan, China, Tibet, Burma, Bangladesh, North Korea, if you look at the amount of displaced people in the 50s and 60s, it is extraordinary. Anyone who took the time to notice, and there weren't many people who took the time to notice in Europe, that new human rights regime was woefully inadequate in terms of protecting the lived realities of refugeedom for millions. So the refugees did not stop flowing with the end of the war. The numbers of displaced people increased. Well, hamstrung by the politics of Cold War, the so-called Magna Carta for refugees, which is still the principal piece of legislation we work with today, the 1951 Convention, whatever its virtues, and it has some, was as much an exercise in boxing in refugees as letting them in. There was a wonderful NGO representative who was asked to comment on a draft of the Refugee Convention in 1951, and he described the draft as appearing to the refugee like a menu at an expensive restaurant, with every course crossed out, except perhaps the soup, and a footnote to the effect that even the soup might not be served in certain circumstances. Palestinian refugees who were exempted from the convention didn't even get offered the soup, only humanitarian food aid, which was administered by the UNRWA, which is the organization set up to look after Palestinians supposedly unpolitically. So that, for my reading, was, on one hand, it was a success, but also it marked a failure to conceive of the lives who lived beyond the dichotomies of citizen or refugee, stateless or stated agent or victim. And in whatever ways that new dawn of human rights woke up to the refugee problem, what it couldn't do, wouldn't do for some, was grant this new reality for millions, an effective legal framework. Or, and I think this is why the work we're doing here is so important, of an effective cultural imaginary and narrative that would make that life, protect the rights of those people. There was a European model of the refugee fleeing persecution that was very much in place in the mid-20th century, but everybody else tended to vanish into a cloud called a humanitarian problem. And that, I think, is the history that is returning today to bite us where it is starting to hurt. Now, Arendt understood this long before others. She thought that the human rights initiatives of the 1940s were unreal. They couldn't grasp the reality. And the reality was, for her mind, unless people could think about political citizenship in new ways, the refugee problem was permanent. And she would not have been at all surprised about anything that's happened over the last 50 years. So what was real was the brute politics of the nation state. And she observed in 1940, she said, you don't then get refugees talking about their human rights. You get refugees talking about the right to return. You get the refugees talking about the right to have a home, because they know that only your own political home structures will actually guarantee you your rights. The consequences of being unable to think about refugee rights or nationhood or citizenship outside of European models was to prove absolutely catastrophic. The formation of the State of Israel, Arendt argued in 1949, and it was a brave thing for her to do at that point for her situation, didn't solve anything. It simply created another 600,000, this was 1949, refugees. Edward Said quotes Arendt on this point in the introduction to his book, The Question of Palestine. Both refugees, Said, one Jewish, one Palestinian, both thinkers got a central point. They understood that the question of refugees was the question of modern political life. And that question is, how can we, as citizens together in a global world, how can we share that world? And so there's a continuity, is basically my point. The slide I would have shown at this point is from Badawi camp in northern Lebanon, which was founded in 1955. And is now host to a second wave of refugees from Syria. They've just opened a street in the camp called Syria Street, where you can get particularly Syrian food. And that camp has grown up, and if you look at the barbed wire around Gur, the barbed wire around Gur camp in 1949 is going round. If you look at Badawi, the barbed wire is up, it's moving vertically, the camp, spreading out in different space. So Arendt's solution to this problem was to be really minimal. She didn't actually believe in human rights to core. She was unimpressed about big claims of human rights. She thought it was just doing dodgy political work. She was very suspicious of humanitarianism and the politics of pity. She said there's only one right that's worth protecting, which she described as the right to have rights. The one right is the right to have rights. And this had nothing to do with one's essential humanity or where you happen to live. It was quite simply, and this is why I get to what we're doing here in this workshop, it's the right to belong to a community. That's the right to have rights. Everyone should have the right to belong to a community. And this right, she said, depended on the right to speech, to tell stories. If we can't tell stories, if we can't show who we are to each other, she said, we can't be a community. And if you can't be a community, you can't have rights. Rights, Arendt wrote back in 1949, exist only because of the plurality of men, because we exist and inhabit the earth together with other men. Only we grant each other rights and take them away, not nature or God or even the authority of this state or even the land, only us. And this, for Arendt, meant that human beings simply are their rights, which is not the same as saying, being merely a human being gives you rights. Rather, what keeps our humanity intact is reciprocity. When we tell each other stories, she said, we disclose ourselves to one another, we become a community. Now, the next thing I want to emphasize is the fact this is a political community for Arendt. Refugee storytelling is often depoliticized in a thoroughly political manner. And as a result, refugee rights are often understood only as the right to be listened to or to deserve pity. Suffering is recognized, but not the right to citizenship. So when I say that refugee testimony is politicized, depoliticized, I mean it's politicized in a very thoroughly political way. For Arendt, on the contrary, what she discovered was that storytelling makes new forms of political community possible. She knew that the game was up for the European nation state. That's why she was so critical of Israel. But she also thought, if we're going to think about politics again, if we can think about new forms of citizenship, then the right to think, the right to speak, to show yourself, to talk, to share, was absolutely crucial. So storytelling matters hugely in this model of political community, not just because it's therapeutic or it's good for individuals or even because it's good for their community, although these things are all absolutely true. And not even just because the right to tell a story is a cultural right that should belong to everybody, but because stories point to bigger histories that implicate everybody and to what Arendt calls the storybook of mankind, which has many actors and speakers without any tangible authors, the storybook of mankind. Now, if we think about this image and this storybook of mankind, it's important. If we think that storytelling isn't important, then think about the restrictions that are put on the kinds of stories that refugees can tell today. They have not got the freedom we just enjoyed this morning to be able to swap stories from their childhood and their experiences. And this is not because they haven't got the right to tell stories. Stories are often demanded of refugees, but they have to be certain types of stories. Refugees have to be very careful about the stories they tell, especially asylum seekers. You tell one story about yourself, someone quotes it, you lose your right to asylum. You tell a story about yourself which is about how witty and clever and ingenious you were and crafty, you lose your right to an asylum because you haven't fed into that image of the suffering victim. So refugees do not have the same right to tell stories, precisely because the stories they tell have to fit within a certain human rights and refugee legislative framework. So I think it's really, really important to remember when we're pushing the idea of storytelling as political, it's in the context where storytelling is heavily, heavily politicized. I hope we can talk a bit about that later. But I also do want to emphasize, and really to push the thinking behind this brilliant initiative a bit further, the right to tell stories, the right to show and be shown, is not just one human right that needs fighting for others. I don't think we should simply be adding cultural rights to an already rather limited human rights menu. I think we should be saying that it's the right above all rights, because it's precisely the right, it's once we start exercising it, could enable us to imagine different ways of sharing political and national spaces together. And I really do think, and that this initiative is further testament, that kind of that need for thinking about new forms of human community is really, really being kindled today, both in the Middle East but also in Europe. And I think when we talk about refugee rights today, many of us, not often our politicians, do so precisely because we believe in a principle of equal liberty. And I'm quoting again from Arendt, who also believed in a principle of equal liberty. The right or belief that everyone should have the same freedoms. Put simply, why should my child get to tell his stories and not your child? Why can my mother grow her vegetables in her garden and not your mother? Why have I just had the freedom to travel that you have not? That's the feeling, I think, behind the principle of equal liberty that draws many of us to events like this and initiatives like this. And it is, of course, a very old principle. The other thing Arendt did after she became a citizen in the US, as well as rereading all of Kafka, which you can kind of understand, is return to the Greeks and to Herodotus. And what Arendt wanted, she said, was a politics based on the principle of isonomia. Isonomia, that's right, which is from Greek theories of democracy, which is not the idea that we give the state the right to give us our rights. It is, isonomia requires the freedom to be disobedient in the name of equal liberty. Isonomia is that kind of thing where you just go, no, it's enough, and it is Arendt rights in the human condition. It's why you need civil disobedience. Rights will not just be given down, they require action, they require civil disobedience out of that sense of, no, this is not enough, it has to change. Now this is, I'm just about to stop here, this is where the poem comes in, because if this is a politics, which I'm suggesting it is, it's a politics that has poetry and storytelling really, really built into it. Prose and poetry, drama, theatre, puppets, films, songs are the types of storytelling I think that most closely correspond to that principle of anomia. Poets, Arendt said, are never reliable citizens. They're civilly disobedient. They have, not just because they do political things, it's because they break the rules as they write and think and tell. They act in terms of civil disobedience all the time. Poetry by itself doesn't make anything happen, but what our relationship to it does. And that's why Arendt would also say the voices of the poet should concern all of us, not just in our private lives, but also because we're citizens. So I'm going to stop now with a story about a certain poem. Later on in the 60s, Arendt recalled that her friend, the philosopher and critic Walter Benjamin, in Paris in 1939, bringing a poem back from Brecht, the playwright and poet, who he'd been visiting in Svenborg. Brecht was also in exile. And he brought the poem back to the refugee community in Paris in 1939. I just want to point out that today, the 26th of September, is the 66th anniversary of the day that Benjamin, on the refugee trail, climbed over the Pyrenees from France to Spain when he was making his own refugee journey, got turned down at the border, and then committed suicide, in one of the stories that we tell from the last refugee crisis. And he did that today, 66 years ago. I think it's quite poignant. Anyway, Benjamin brings this, and it's not an easy climb. I've done it. I mean, if someone had told me that I had to go all the way back after I'd done that, it's a hard, hard climb. And the other thing, sorry, just to say about this, when you've done this hard climb, the first thing you see today as you cross the Spanish border and you look down on Portbou is loads of shipping containers. And shipping containers today are, of course, emblematic of certain refugee housing. So that sense of the continuities of refugee history. And the whole trail is now graffitied by contemporary refugees and contemporary refugees activists, more from Spain than from France, is very, very striking. Anyway, the poem that Benjamin brought back to the refugee community from Brecht was a poem which I've handed out, a very loose translation, called The Legend of the Origin of the Book of Ching during Lao Tse's journey into exile, which, despite its appallingly wordy title, really spread, Arendt said, throughout the refugee community. The refugees, she said, recording later, learnt the poem by heart. They spoke it even before it was written down, before it was published. And it traveled through the 15th arrondissement, into the camps, into the other camps, along the refugee trails, through the waiting queues, across the mud, cold, and the heat, and over the mountains. The poem, if you have a look at the translation, and I've got Matthew Reynolds and lots of translators looking at me, and I must say, I did have the German version of this, which I then tried to translate, but I realized I was trying to translate it as Arendt was translating the German into English. I cannot do because my German is not good enough, and it ended up being a real mess. So I did that unforgivable thing, is I grabbed a translation off the internet, and I couldn't find who had done the translation. I'm sitting right in front of Matthew, who is going to really tell me off, because you should always attribute translators, especially when they've done such remarkable work. But if you read the poem, what the poem tells us is how we owe the amazing book of Delle to a border guard who, as the immigrant Lao Tse was traveling into exile, the border guard stops and he asks him, says, well, what have you got? What can you bring? And he just says, well, I'm a teacher. I've got some wisdom. And instead of turning him away, the border guard says, well, let's hear it. Let's hear what your wisdom is. And the border guard abandons the border, doesn't do his job, looks after this guy for 7 days, feeds him, shelters him, while Lao Tse then writes down all the 81 sayings that later become the Dao De Ching. So it's a poem that shows how a generous and curious immigration policy enriches the sum of human wisdom. It's a fantastic poem. Arendt and her fellow refugees loved it, she says, for the message it had about resilience. And resilience is a word you hear a lot in terms of humanitarian community, but she didn't quite mean it in the way that people mean it today. They loved it for the message it had about resilience. You understand, says the sage through his nave, you understand this, that the soft water in movement defeats the might stone in time. You understand the tough are beaten, that soft water in movement defeats the might stone in time. You understand the tough are beaten. That's Arendt's translation. And just that idea of movement, moving water, will actually work away against the hardness of the stone, and it will endure. It's an extraordinary poem. And like I said, and like Arendt, remember this poem spread, she said, like a rumor of good tidings, a source of consolation, patience, and endurance, where such wisdom was most needed. Now, this poem is today what a lot of literary critics would call a transnational poem. It borrows from many different poetic traditions across time and place. And as Arendt pointed out in an earlier essay on Brecht, she didn't like Brecht very much at the end because she thought he sold out to Stalin. But she said at this point, few writers so consistently attempted to reach an international audience. His poems crossed cultures and nations, not because he had a wide poetic range. And actually the poem, he doesn't borrow prosody very much. Brecht is Brecht. But what he's borrowing is the ideas of different nations and different traditions. But he did it out of the conviction that the experience and conclusions of the men of this century are roughly the same everywhere. He said Arendt, man needs help from every creature born. Brecht's borrowing, she says, is a necessary preparation to the foundations of kindness until at least comes to pass that man can help fellow man. It's a poem, in other words, Arendt thought, that was written in the spirit of equal liberty that I spoke about earlier. And the poem was Hannah Arendt's story in transit. Now, I not only find this poem, the story, for it is a story after all, it is Arendt telling a story about a poem and about the poem's journey, about refugees quoting one another, a richly cosmopolitan and generous poem about the importance of hospitality, friendship, curiosity, mutual recognition. I not only find it intensely moving, I also think that in telling this story, Arendt was also showing us, back from the last century, enacting her own ethics and politics of human community. One last quote. Arendt wrote, "The reason why each life tells its story and why history becomes the storybook of mankind is action. The reason why each life tells its story and why history becomes the storybook of mankind is action." I give you this poem and this story today in the hope that our storytelling too this week will be an action. Thank you.
Thank you, Lyndsey, in perfect time. And thank you for this accurate and deep presentation of such a crucial topic, which is the migrant crisis. And thank you for providing us with historical and literary evidences, and at the same time highlighting the intellectual and cultural rights of these arrivants. And the possibility to share stories with us. So it was very, very stimulating. Thank you so much. Do you have any questions? Shall we open the discussion? Do we have enough time? Yes.
Thanks. I just wanted to share. I'm worried about the language of community, so that when you're talking, you could see what's wrong with grounding human rights in the European model of the nation state, because if you're not in that nation state, you haven't got any. And then you say, well, okay, let's have a more, or quoting Arendt, but storytelling, and I worried a little bit about this in our practice this morning and wanted to ask Ben about it too, which is when you're reaching out and building a community, how that inevitably forms a border, and so that Ben, we were all sort of participating in a border crossing activity, but at the same time, inevitably, we were sharing memories which grounded us in a community from which some people were going to be excluded. And so that's how you handle that. There's a sort of question of practice, I suppose, about how you, as soon as you use the word community, it's got some people in it and other people not in it necessarily as part of the word. And I was just wondering about how you get round that. So moving from, saying, okay, the nation, we can see what the problem with the nation state is. Let's have a more fluid model of storytelling which builds a community. You have the right. The right is the right to have rights, and that's grounded in storytelling, and storytelling creates a community. But as soon as you're creating a community, it's got some people in it and other people not in it, inevitably. And I just wondered about that. Is that a conceptual question? Is it a practical question? I'm always worried about the sort of border of that.
Yeah, I think it...
Microphone.
It's a great question, Matthew. But I think it's also a question of where the eye looks. And going back to the idea that refugee storytelling has been going on for a very, very long time. And I think one of the models to think about, which certainly works in communities which are hosting, refugee communities which are hosting new refugee communities. And I think we're quite often get very trapped in a kind of humanitarian model. I read endless grant applications that we're going to go and do creative writing workshops and film workshops with the camps. And you think, well, actually, there are people who are already doing this. and they're doing it, you know, there's refugee to refugee humanitarianism, which is telling a long history of displacement. So the contemporary historian, literary historian in me thinks, well, we should just shut up and make sure we can find places that that story gets told and gets listened to. That would be my one answer. But also I'd say that communities, and Chris Smith made the point, are always changing. And one of the things that migrants and refugees do is change communities and invent new communities. Arendt used to talk about natality, the principle of the new. And I think we need to acknowledge that as well. I mean, Marina spoke brilliantly about being careful about the politics of memory culture. Although they're very, very important, we also need a kind of a culture of the future. So what kind of communities will be imagined out of this activity, which will involve some people shutting up.
Some more questions? I do have a question myself, which is about the role of the exile, the conceptual meaning of the exile. It's amazing if you think how the exile used to be gazed as something mystical, maybe transmitting fear, wonder, and now we look at the term in theory and practice as something which is maybe representing misfortune or something suspicious. What do you think about it?
Yeah, you've just quoted Arendt back at me, where there's a great quote she has from the 1940s, and it says the concept of exile used to be treated with awe, and is now, exiles are treated as suspicious and unfortunate. I think some of that awe came back in European culture. The idea of the Cold War dissident, exile, the refugee, and fear of persecution is still very dominant in the cultural imaginary of certain concepts of refugeedom. Whereas Arendt was clever because what she saw is that people weren't going to be given that right to that romantic myth, the romantic myth, and that great essay Edward Said wrote in 1984, which is not an insignificant date, that, you know, when Edward Said says no amount of humanizing can make the mutilations of exile human. He's absolutely given on that. And I'll draw a line between that experience of the mid-40s and 1984, very, very direct line. So it has shifted, and I think as us in the arts and humanities need to be very alert to the different types of exile, the different types of modeling, romanticization. The difference between an exiled poet and a refugee who's writing is huge. You know, I mean, some writers have access to extraordinary amounts of publishing rights, protection rights, etc., etc. A lot of refugee writers don't have any of those, and yet they're producing and writing.
Yes, one more question.
I don't want in any way to take us always back to classics, but I did want to play with just a Roman concept, because there's a lot of Greek floating around. When Cicero is trying to define what somebody who is a member of the citizen body of Italy is, he talks about municipium, municipality, and the critical thing is, and it's a definition that people get that was much disputed, but it fundamentally comes down to the capacity to receive and give benefits. To be a member of a citizen body is to be able to give and receive benefits. And I was very struck by how you might work that into a history of action. It's not solely, he was clearly talking in a world that was highly elitist, but nevertheless that it's grounded capacity to do something. And I did wonder, because I was also worried about the dissolution of the nation-state narrative in various ways and what goes in its place, is the capacity to make the incomer have the capacity to do something might be a very useful way of giving meaning. It's clearly happening in some of the places that you're describing, but it clearly isn't happening in the story that I was hearing the other day of an asylum seeker stuck, unable to do anything for best part of a decade, therefore neither receiving nor giving benefit because of that exclusion. And it's an interesting, highly stoic view of what a citizen might do.
There's a great comment rather than a question, so I'll just respond by any excuse to read Cicero, fine by me. But I think the principle of rereading around the summer did make me think of the kind of politics that's happening in Europe and the Middle East today, and that her conception of action and disobedience did read in a very, very timely way, which it hasn't for a long time. And Cicero is part of that. Oh.
Iraqi community migrant in London. I present a program called If I Were You. And in this program, every listener called me live program talking about his new life and how they can communicate it with the Iraqi community, different community, and it's once a week program, and every week the listeners become a community. And we shared their difficulties, problems, social life, family's problem, and everyone, when we start the program and after 3 months maybe, everyone feels his problem is comparing with the others is very little. And this is, I feel, it's a new communication, a new society, a new life. The media, the role of media play a great role in this situation with the refugee. And the radio, it's the best. Because when we're talking, I present myself from deep to them. And also I can feel them when they talk through the phone. And really, we did a friendship with the very big, they went to Iraqi association and they asked each other and they found a place to meeting and sharing and helping. Thank you. Yeah, the red.
No,
Then I think that we could all move downwards for the coffee break, and we will be back in 20 minutes. Ci vediamo tra circa 20 minuti, scendiamo per il coffee break, per la causa. Thank you, Lyndsey. Thank you,